Department of Anthropology and of Urban Studies and Planning. We welcome you to this afternoon talk by David Harvey. David is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the City University of New York. He has a PhD in Geography from the University of Cambridge. His work has been translated into 15 languages. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. These translated works are over 20 books, beginning in 1969 with Explaining Geography, 1973, Social Justice and the City, 1982, The Limits of Capital, 1985, Consciousness and Urban Experience, 1989, The Condition of Postmodernity, where I first met you in that book, 1989, The Urban Experience, 1996, Justice, Nature and the Geography of Difference, 2003, New Imperialism, 2003, Paris, the Capital of Modernity, and more recently, the last three titles, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, A Companion to Marx, Volume 1, which some of you may have seen online, and The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism. I give you David Harvey.
Thank you. Yeah, the Enigma book really came out of a project that I increasingly became enamored of after 2000 or so, which was to try to use my understandings coming out of years of working with Marxian theory and Marxian political economy, and to bring that theoretical apparatus to bear on contemporary problems. And in an even more challenging problem was to do it in a way that people could understand. The last bit was not easy. And it produced 3 books, The New Imperialism, Brief History of Neoliberalism, and then The Enigma of Capital. And The Enigma of Capital, of course, was written in the midst of the crisis, 2008, 2009. And, of course, events were moving very quickly. And while I could lay out some basic framework for understanding what was happening, and, if you like, the main idea behind that, I should try to establish very directly here. The main idea was that capital never solves its crisis tendencies, it simply moves them around. And the only interesting question is where does it move to? And it moves in a double sense. It moves geographically. It also moves sectorally from one kind of problem to another. And so I set out to, if you like, describe how the crisis unfolded from 2007 through 2008 to 2009, how that crisis unfolded in both of those senses, but also to put it against the background of an argument which is very important to me, that somehow there is a real sense in which there's a connectivity between the nature of the crisis as it was experienced in 2008, 2009, and the way we came out of the crisis of the 1970s. In other words, you solved a bunch of problems in the 1970s by various stratagems, which I described in the Brief History of Neoliberalism. But those strategies actually led capital to start to have difficulties in other areas, and those other areas lay at the root of the issue of what happened in 2008, 2009. Now, The Enigma was published 6 months ago in this country, last April in Britain. And we're going to a paperback edition, and I was asked to write an afterword. And of course, the interesting thing here is that as soon as you write something, it becomes outdated. Things are getting extremely fast, actually. But the one thing I was very proud of myself, writing in December last year, I said the direction we're headed right now is almost certain to create a big confrontation between the state and the public sector unions. And it was plain as a pikestaff, it was coming, you know. But of course, I've written this thing, and I can't even mention Wisconsin because it's already in press, and so you want to bring it back and say, hey, I want to get into Wisconsin now, and I want to get into, and then of course there's Egypt, and you know, all kinds of things. So things are moving very, very quickly. But I thought that I would try not to talk so much about what I wrote in Enigma, but to talk about what I thought about as I went into the afterword, because the big shift in the crisis that occurred was that a crisis was being experienced in 2008, 2009 in the financial system. It was solved in a way by a patchwork of government interventions of various sorts around the world in different ways in different places and all the rest of it. But the consequence of that was that the stress associated with the crisis was moved from the financial system into the state system. Geographically, there was also some remarkable shifts occurring. In the original Enigma, for example, I just managed to catch the proofs to throw something in there about, oh, Dubai has exploded, you know, sort of, so that was an update there. But the shifts into the state sector have actually had important consequences, and it's that I really want to talk about, because I think it's going to dictate very much what's going to happen over the next few years. As a result of a lot of the state interventions and other aspects, the financial crisis was essentially declared over. In this country, for example, the National Bureau of Economic Research says that the recession ended in June of 2009. So it's gone. I'm writing about something that no longer exists. And of course, if you go to China, China's booming like crazy, India's booming like crazy, all of those countries around that are caught up in the China trade, including a lot of Latin America, are booming. So where's the crisis? What are we talking about? What is this? Now, there are two things here. And the first is we still are having very serious difficulties in one arena, and that is, of course, employment. And there was a report by the IMF and the ILO that came out last September which pointed out something really very dramatic, and I think it's important to bear this in mind. They calculated that in the course of the crisis from about 2007 to 2009, something like 30 million jobs were lost around the world. Of the 20 million they could sort of document through formal data, 7.5 million were lost in the United States alone. 2.7 million were lost in Spain. 0.9 million were lost in Britain. In other words, the mass of the job loss was concentrated geographically in those few countries, and particularly in the upper income countries. The so-called emerging economies did not suffer the same job losses, and if they did, they was rather shallow, very short. China lost 3 million jobs in 2009, but regained them, pretty much all of them, in 2010. So there is a job crisis, and the job crisis is really, really concentrated here. Now, like all good Americans who believe when you play a baseball game you can call it the World Series, so everybody here thinks there's a global crisis. There's not. Like I said, many parts of the world are doing fine. Australia is booming because it's sending so much stuff to China, you know, and the interest rate's gone up. There may be difficulties of certain kinds of inequality and, you know, and all those other issues, but actually there's no real crisis except in the United States and in many areas of Europe. But when you look at the data in Europe, you find something very peculiar. That is, unemployment has surged. It went up by 11 percentage points in Spain. It went up by 7 percentage points in Ireland. 5 percentage points in the United States and 3 percentage points in, Greece and Portugal and Sweden and the like. It hardly budged at all in the Netherlands, and it didn't budge at all in Germany. So within the European Union, there is considerable disparity as to where the unemployment crisis is being felt. This then leads me to say, well, why these disparities? What's going on? And why are we still tending to think we are in a crisis, even though the NBER says we're not? And I think this has, to some degree, something to do with the politics of the situation. Whereas I think 2007, 2008 was essentially a breakdown of the economic system, and therefore you had to look at the economy and what was going on with all the fictitious capital and all the rest of it, what was going on there. And some of that is still going on, of course. But you have now to look at the state, and you have to look at the politics of it all. And there's a very definite sense in which I think, as Rahm Emanuel said, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. Which means that if you can prolong the crisis, because you have an agenda, you do. So part of the issue right now, it seems to me, is the political response within the state apparatus. And of course, the political response in this country is dominated by this incredible furor about the debt. And what are we going to do about the debt? And Now, it's not that debt is not a problem. It is indeed a problem. But why are we suddenly focusing on that rather than something else? Because if you want to get rid of the debt, then one of the ways in which, of course, you do it is through a politics of austerity. So politically, what we've had over the last year and a half is we went, in the immediate wake of the crisis, a sort of a fluttering with Keynesian stimulus programs and state interventionism, so suddenly a rhetoric about the debt really matters, and austerity is on the books. And that was very much located in this country, and of course it became the centerpiece of Cameron's policies in Britain, and it also became part and parcel of some of what was going to happen to some of the weaker economies in the European Union. So austerity is the answer. Now this is you don't have to be a very sophisticated Keynesian. I mean, you can read Paul Krugman, he'll tell you the same thing, that if you go into austerity at a time of difficulty, then what you do is you throw people out of work. And since we want to create jobs, why are we throwing people out of work? Cameron's austerity measures are scheduled to create about 500,000